Good afternoon. We're going to get started with the keynote speaker. There is ample food outside, so please feel free to get up and take some more. If you have bags with you, you can also take some home. I forgot my zip bag, so I can't help on that score. So Dr. Harris from the Political Science Department here at the university. I'm also co-director with Dr. Hopper for the Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service at the university. And I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. I do want to start with a quote. "Public service must be more than doing a job efficiently and honestly. It must be a complete dedication to the people." And this is a quote from Margaret Chase Smith, who was a Republican, the first woman who was elected to both the U.S. House to represent the state of Maine and then the U.S. Senate. And she also, in 1969, became the first woman to actively seek the presidential nomination for her political party. Obviously, she did not win it because we don't have a first woman president yet, but Margaret Chase Smith is very well known for her honesty and integrity as a public servant. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Craig Wheeland, who is a professor of public administration at Villanova University and serves as Senior Vice Provost for Academics. He received his BA in history and a master's in public administration from the University of South Carolina and a PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. And I just found out he was a student there with Dr. Bressler, who was just presenting at the ethics. So we have lots of connections here. Craig has significant experience as an academic leader and an exemplary record of teaching, scholarship, and service. His research interests include leadership by elected officials and professional administrators in city and suburban governments, collaborative problem-solving approaches such as community-wide strategic planning, and municipal government institutions. His articles have appeared in some of the leading journals in the field of public administration. He has also published numerous book chapters and received external funding for several research projects. His teaching interests at Villanova have featured public administration theory and history, urban politics and government, city management, and the intergovernmental, intersectoral management of public programs. I knew I was going to stumble over that. And so the title of his talk this afternoon, Reform Politics, Professional Municipal Management, and the Common Good. Doctor, what do you want?
Thank you, Dr. Harris, for the introduction. I want to say how grateful I am and honored to be invited to be your keynote speaker today. Thank you. I see Dean Maldonado is here. Thank you for attending. And I want to say a special thanks again to Dr. Harris and Dr. Hopper for inviting me to speak with you today. This is an opportunity for me to reflect on and think about 40 years worth of teaching and research and participation with many people in local government in Pennsylvania, as I pulled together numerous ideas that I would share with students or with city managers, township managers in Pennsylvania, and so on some of these key topics about reform, about how do you pursue good government at the local level. And what I thought I'd do today is place my talk and provide a historical context for why it's important that the Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service is now part of Scranton, and how that creation of this center is part of a century-long, more than a century-long effort to reform government institutions and practices across the nation. So I'm going to talk about a few major topics here. I'm just going to give you an overview of where the talk's going. We're going to start by talking about the idea of the reform impulse in American political culture. Then I'll shift to focusing on one part of that reform impulse, or one result of it, and that's the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Then I'll talk a little bit about the legacy of that movement and its enduring impact on our local government structures and practices today. Then I'll focus on one piece of that movement's legacy, and that's the professional municipal manager. And I'll profile several municipal managers to show how they help realize, in partnership with their elected officials, with nonprofit organizations in the community, with businesses and other forms of government other government officials in the neighboring communities to bring about good government in their particular community. Richard Hofstadter is a progressive historian who came up with this notion of a reform impulse in American political culture. So he wrote about the Age of Reform, which was about 1880 to 1930. It starts off in rural areas and small towns across America as the populist movement. And by the 1890s, there started to be a groundswell of support for reform in larger cities and across the country. And so the progressive era, from the roughly 1900 to 1920, that's its zenith, so to speak, that became the engine that generates many kinds of reforms that impact us to this day. So what is this reform impulse? Richard Hofstadter says, a great part of both the strength and the weaknesses of our national existence lies in the fact that Americans do not abide very quietly the evils of life. We are forever restlessly pitting ourselves against them, demanding changes, improvements, remedies, but often, not often, with sufficient sense of the limits that the human condition will in the end insistently impose on us. There's this restlessness in American political culture that always is asking the question, how can we do better? And this is grounded in our Constitution. Recall the opening sentence of the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of these United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So from the very founding period, we've been a people who've questioned how things are done and how we could do better. Progressivism is the movement, again, that starts in the 1890s, comes to its heyday in the 1900 and 1920 period. And Richard Hofstadter defines for us progressivism as an impulse toward criticism and change that was everywhere so conspicuous after 1900, when the already forceful stream of agrarian discontent was enlarged and redirected by the growing enthusiasm of the middle-class people for social and economic reform. Another historian, Ernest Griffith, defined progressivism as pragmatism with a conscience. So there's this effort to really change politics through institutions and practices and laws to aspire to something better. So we'll start off by talking about what's the progressive vision for why you go into politics. What's the purpose of politics? And progressive reformers a century ago engaged in politics in a public regarding way. It wasn't about what they could do for themselves personally or their family or their friends or their neighbors or their group. In that sense, they're not private regarding. Their motivation to get into politics was to change government for the better, to have government live up to certain key values that I'll speak about in a moment. So when they engaged in politics, they brought a universalistic conception of what the public interest is. It's not what the interest of you or your neighbor or your group or your political party is, or your class or religion. It's not that. It's something that we all have in common. It's not this particularistic motivation that does drive some people to get into politics. But the progressives aspire to a different idea about what public service is. So I mentioned a moment ago values. These are 6 core values that I think help define what the progressive movement of a century ago pursued, based our actions on, and they still resonate with us today when we think about what does it mean to have good government. Well, you want honest government, you want efficient government, you want economical government, impartiality in the delivery of services, expertise in helping to guide the decision-making of our elected officials, and a concept called Americanism, which I'll explain in a few moments. So I'm going to talk about each of these values briefly. Honesty should be the paramount concern in everything we do in public and private life, so think the progressives. A common definition is not lying, cheating, stealing, or taking unfair advantage. It's doing your work in an honorable, truthful, and trustworthy way. So any notion that there's a type of graft that is honest, that you can do in politics, and that's okay to do, is actually very detrimental to the democratic character of government. And so citizens have an obligation to help improve the lives and opportunities of all members of the community. Efficiency is government producing a certain amount of output at the lowest possible cost. Efficiency is in the interest of everybody. It means our taxes are lower, our fees are lower, and our government is aspiring to maintain that kind of an approach. And so good government is efficient government. Economy refers to the choices that elected officials make in partnership with citizens and everyone else. The idea is to choose to do things, in other words, public policies and services, which cannot be produced by citizens and organizations in the private sector. And then also, government should not waste resources on low priority services and instead rely on the private sector to meet some of those needs. So the progressives weren't saying government does everything, but progressives were saying government can do things that the private sector is failing to do. Build good roads, offer sanitation services, clean water, and so on. Public safety, police and fire, public works, etc. So there were things the progressives thought government should do and do it in a way that's economical. Impartiality is really important in the progressive movement, and it continues to be so to local governments today. The idea is that government's going to deliver public services without fear or favor. What does that mean? It means allegiances to a political party or to a group or a neighborhood or class or religion or friends or family is not the basis for how you get treated as a citizen in your community. The police should protect you whether you're Republican or Democrat. The roads on the street and the potholes in the road should be fixed regardless of the neighborhood you live in. You should have access to good parks and recreation regardless of where you live. It's a high standard. Government should be impartial in how it delivers services and how it responds to the needs of citizens in a way that doesn't allow these kind of particularistic considerations to drive the delivery of services. Expertise refers to the idea that people who are knowledgeable about doing a certain job should be the basis for their appointment. It really attacks the notion of a patronage system or a nepotism system that doesn't take also into account one's qualifications for the job. Patronage, I'll give an example. When you're appointing citizens to a board or commission, yeah, that could be a form of patronage because you're reaching out to your supporters. But if they're qualified to serve on that board, that's important. And it's when patronage becomes a problem is when that basis of qualification fails. Well, in the case of progressive movement, they talked about ways to protect this notion of expertise through things like a merit system, which I'll speak about in a little later, and in the employment of professional municipal managers as well. Finally, this notion of Americanism. I take it from this book written by Herbert Crowley. He was a Republican of the progressive era. He wrote an important book called The Promise of American Life. And in it, he captures this notion of Americanism as he defines it as a patriotic commitment to make America live up to the promise of the founding period. So take that into account and think about the great leaders we reflect on throughout the last 200 years and look how the rhetoric that they used. Frederick Douglass speaking at the centennial of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? He references the unfulfilled promises of those documents. Or an Abraham Lincoln, or a Theodore Roosevelt, or a Franklin Roosevelt, or Martin Luther King, and on and on and on. Or Susan B. Anthony, and so on. They're raising the questions about what these founding documents say and what hasn't been realized yet. What the promise is, but the promise is not yet kept. And that's what the progressives embrace, this notion of we got to be better. We have certain core values and principles that we need to live up to. And as Crowley would say, it's the promise of American life. So what are the agents of change that bring about good government? In the progressive era, it was the good government organization, sometimes by their critics called goo-goos, okay? But they took pride in being identified as good government organizations, and in their communities, they would promote their plans, they would try to persuade voters, they'd try to support particular candidates who were going to bring about reforms. They usually worked outside of the political party, but not always. Sometimes they would try to take over a particular party. It didn't matter if it was Democrat or Republican or some other name. If it became the right vehicle for them to get their candidates running and gathering support and mobilizing voters, they'd use that party to do that. In 1896, more than 180 local government organizations belonged to the National Municipal League, which had been formed in 1894. So these are general civic organizations, often coalitions of other groups in the community that cared about reform in their local governments. The Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service here at Scranton is like a good government organization. It's the heir of that tradition. And in the room here, I notice I've met a few people already from some of the nonprofits in our area. I met Gerard a little while ago, and some other folks too. And these organizations also care and are allies of the center and help and bring about good government in the long tradition established by good government organizations in the progressive era. So what's the legacy of the progressive era? There's a lot of things we could talk about. I've just identified a few here. The first is the importance of codes of ethics and of ethics training. And I know this is the feature of today's conference, and I went to one of the panels at 11 that talked about Scranton's Code of Ethics and Lackawanna County's Code of Ethics. And it was a really interesting discussion that shows both the hope, but also the limitations that these new boards of ethics have in trying to, through the use of a code of ethics and training, bring about better government in the city of Scranton and in Lackawanna County. Well, most cities across the United States now have either an ethics code or they'll have ethics training. They may well have an ethics board. And they all face similar kinds of challenges as to being impactful. There's high energy when they're created, but maintaining and sustaining that is a challenge over time. Nonpartisan elections were a key tool that the progressive advocated. That's where your name is listed for the ballot for an office without party affiliation. They were usually successful. 3/4 of all local governments across the nation now use nonpartisan elections. However, in the Mid-Atlantic, it's the opposite. 90% of local governments in the Mid-Atlantic, almost, and in Pennsylvania, it's everybody, uses partisan elections. What's that?
I just said, oh, God.
Well, I don't want to necessarily be very critical of partisan elections. Partisan elections can generate very vigorous political competitions, and that's good for voters. And they do help mobilize people. The problem is that when they carry that partisan loyalty to the governing side. They might win the election, but then when they govern, are they going to govern strictly by their party and their loyalty that way? And that includes in appointing people and hiring people and contracting and so on. And there's where the challenges arise. So I'll give an example in a little while of a community where a manager served for 24 years, and 23 of those 24 years, election to election, it might switch. 3 Republican, 2 Democrat, 4 Democrat, 1 Republican, 3, 2, back and forth over his whole career. But he still worked effectively with each of those because the tradition in that community up until his last year in office was to set aside that and work together on a more issue-focused and, I would say, good government effort in their community. Merit systems are also very common now in local government. If not a fully developed merit system, some partial systems, maybe in the hiring of particular kinds of employees. The Model City Charter was something the progressives were very proud of at the local level. They started off in the 1890s endorsing the strong mayor council form of government. Why strong? What does that mean? That means the mayor can veto an ordinance, can propose a legislative agenda, submit a budget for approval, appoint people to boards and commissions, appoint the cabinet or the leadership of the city government, be responsible for delivering services of the public across the board. And the reason the progressives initially advocated for the strong mayor was because the systems of government in place at that time had weak mayors. They didn't have these formal authorities. And so instead, authority was diffuse and decentralized to different elected officials and different boards and commissions, which the progressives believed were a reason why so much corruption existed in government. So the strong mayor became a very popular form of government, especially in larger cities, and that's true to this day. If you look at most large cities, they are mayor-council forms of government. The other form that the the Model City Charter endorses is the council manager form, which they endorsed in 1915. And this form of government I'll talk about in a moment when I go to my next slide, so I don't want to go into detail. But I want to leave you with this thought. Over the decades since the establishment of these two charters, two types of government, there's been an adoption by each form of the other's features. So in the council manager form, for example, there are ways to empower a mayor to do a little bit more, have a little more formal responsibility for leadership in those forms of government. Also, in the mayor-council form, professional administrators are often hired now to be working with the mayor. Like in Philadelphia, there's a managing director, just to give you that one example. So in a way, there's been a hybridization of these forms of government over time. But I'll talk about in a moment one of the defining features of what the council manager form is and how it distinguishes it still from the mayor-council form. And finally, I'll talk a few moments about the city management professionalism and how city management professionalism can contribute to good government. So the council manager plan, as I said, was invented in actually 1910, but the National Municipal League adopted it in 1915. And this is a distinguishing feature. An elected city council or township or borough or county council will hire a professional manager. They'll appoint this professional manager and to whom they delegate administrative and managerial authority over government operations. The city manager serves at the pleasure of the city council and so could be removed at will. Now, in the contemporary time, employment agreements are often used, even in Pennsylvania, within that 2-year period. So from when the election happens, then the manager will get a new employment agreement. It will specify things like salary, benefits, severance if they decide within that 2-year period to fire the manager, which they can do any day of the week. So a manager could be thinking things are going great and walk in on their Thursday night board meeting and leave unemployed. Now they'll get their severance. So an employment agreement doesn't guarantee a job. All it does is create an orderly exit, if that's what the township or the borough or the city or the county want to do. Okay, so what are 5 contemporary reasons why you might want to hire a professional manager? Why would you want to do that? Well, again, I'll go back. City management professionalism is part of the legacy of the progressive reform era. And think of managers as a potential partner with folks on a board of ethics trying to implement a code of ethics. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. So first, these core values, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and inclusion, are all important to the contemporary city management approach. You get a professional manager working in your local government, they're going to think about efficiency as I've defined it already for you. They're going to think about effectiveness, which is, think of it as a goal achievement. What percentage effectiveness? You're delivering services to the public. How effective are they? Are you achieving the goals that you set out for in the delivery of those services? And equity inclusion is about creating an environment of respect, of connection of diverse ideas, backgrounds, and talent throughout your organization and your community. It has to be a very welcoming place. So when you read anything about professional city management these days, equity and inclusion are front and center as one of the core values that link up to these others that I've mentioned. Professional managers bring their personal integrity, but that's not enough. They also bring their professional integrity. They adhere to the International City County Management Association's Code of Ethics. There's a state affiliate in Pennsylvania, the Association for Pennsylvania Municipal Management. They use the same code of ethics. And I'll talk about what those principles are in that code of ethics in a moment. I want to go on and highlight the other 3 reasons why you might want to include a professional manager in your city or county government. First, advanced ability to use essential management practices. Another one is extensive knowledge of services, and the other is access to information networks. I'll talk about each of those briefly. First, on efficiency and effectiveness. Professional management has been documented to be important both in mayor-council governments and in council-manager governments. The IBM Global Business Services benchmarking study of the 100 largest cities in the United States found that management was the single most important factor impacting the efficiency of the city. Think of these cities as being measured by the private sector standards of efficiency, and which ones rise to the top of being very efficient government operations. It's ones that are well managed, both strategically when making strategic choices and operational decisions as well. So a professional management approach can be beneficial to a mayor-council form or a council-manager form in achieving efficiency and effectiveness. And then there's this commitment that the city manager or township manager or borough manager has to their code of ethics. And I've summarized here, not all of them, there's about 12 tenets in the code of ethics, but I'm just pulling out phrases for you. And this is what a professional municipal manager pledges themselves to. They're held accountable by their professional association too. They can be expelled, they can be censored if they violate these codes. Respect and partner with elected officials. Refrain from all political activities which undermine public confidence in professional administrators. Follow merit principles in managing staff. Handle problems without discrimination on the basis of principle and justice. Keep the elected officials and community well informed. Avoid personal gain through favors or use of confidential information. Commit to lifelong learning and professional development. I'm going to present to you in a few moments 3 profiles of municipal managers that I think from Pennsylvania that have done really well to help realize these different values. And I'll speak, when I go through those profiles, I'll reference a couple of these key parts of the code. Municipal managers typically have a graduate education. Normally it's a master's of public administration, but it's not by rule that it has to be. We have lawyers, we have MBAs, we have PhDs, not many, like 1% of the profession. Masters of public policy and so on. But the most common degree is the Master of Public Administration. Professional training. These folks engage in lifelong learning. It's an ethical expectation for them. It's built into their code of ethics. And there's conferences and ongoing training throughout the year helping these managers stay up to the latest knowledge about public safety or public works, health, and so on. They define for the profession a set of essential management practices that they're expected to master in the course of their career. And I've just listed several here for you. Financial management and budgeting, human resources management, strategic leadership and planning, communication and information sharing, policy facilitation and implementation, negotiation and mediation. On that last point, managers with some experience, maybe not the one hired when they're 25 or 26, but the longer they serve, they'll begin to become some of the most effective facilitators and mediators and negotiators in your community, helping bring together people to accomplish good things. One of my examples of a successful manager showcases that ability. Think about all these public services. You run for city council, you run for borough council, you run for county council. You might know a little bit about some of these because you get those services. You might know about your library. Maybe you served on the library board, but you don't know anything about, other than what you read in the newspaper, about public safety or public works. A manager, again, maybe not age 25 or 26 or 27, but by the time they've served 5 to 10 years, they become an expert in all of these areas. And they hire people to report to them, to be department chairs and directors of all those operations that report to them. And they bring that wealth of experience and knowledge to a council to help the council make really informed and good decisions about public services and financing of them. Finally, managers today are part of an extensive information network. So when they have a question, they won't just try to figure it out on their own. They'll reach out to neighboring professional managers in the region. Or maybe they'll look to ICMA and call up ICMA or APMM, or they might tap into some conferences they go to and bring ideas back to their community, right? You have a professional working for your local government who's constantly part of this network and can tap into it very quickly. You have questions about how to set up a board of ethics. If you had a professional manager, they could find you dozens of examples in a day and give you all the details and help you figure out what you want to do. Okay. So I have 3 examples here of managers that have been quite successful in Pennsylvania. Paul Cornell from Swatara Township 22,000 population, is near Harrisburg. This is a Harrisburg township, near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Paul's now retired. He just retired a few years ago. So I'm going to tell you a story about how successful he was on a project in Swatara. Stephanie Tioli Cools, current township manager of Middletown Township down in Bucks County, township of about 45,000, that's just outside of Philadelphia. And Stephanie still is the manager currently there. And then Greg Smith from Moon Township, a population of about 25,000. Moon Township is just a suburb of Pittsburgh, so it's out west. I'll talk about Greg and his efforts to manage an ethical dilemma, series of ethical dilemmas with his staff. Okay, so Paul helped solve an economic problem. The AMP Business Park closes in that township. That lost 2,400 jobs, went out the door. That's a big economic loss. Then the Harrisburg East Mall also is having problems. Stores are closing. At risk, 940 more jobs. So Paul leads the effort with his staff, working with developers and other business people to address this problem. The business park and mall are next to each other. He's the facilitator that brings the owners of the tech park and the mall together to figure out how to do something together. Right? He brings that. He's the agent that makes that linkage. So Paul and his staff work with new owners of the business park to transform it into Tech Port, a high-tech business park. And Paul and his staff work closely with developers who purchased the financially troubled Harrisburg East Mall, and they work to bring Bass Pro into that mall. And so if you're driving along the turnpike, you're going to see this big Bass Pro. Well, Paul's with the agent. I'm not giving him all the credit. He would never accept that. But you need somebody who's leading, somebody who's willing to put the time in with their expertise and their staff to pull it all together. So I give you a little visual here. There's the map. Along the turnpike, you can see the locations of Techport and the mall and that lovely new sign. Stephanie is a great example of how a manager can help solve a communication problem within their community and an economic problem at the same time. Stephanie goes off to the International City County Management Association in Boston. She hears a presentation from the Boston city folks who talk about how they set up vans that would drive around the city and be mini city halls. Right? You want to register for a recreation league program, you can do it right there at the van. Okay, it's a great idea. She comes back and says, you know what? We need to do a better job taking services out to people, and our mall is losing stores and is financially troubled. Let's open up a municipal operation there for a couple hours on a day so people could come in, and like a mobile city hall, they could register, they could pay fines, taxes, whatever they want to do. And so she set that up. It was quite successful, and from what I understand, it's still going on. Finally, Greg Smith, Moon Township. Greg is sort of an exemplary manager. That's why one of the reasons I picked to talk about Greg. He was manager of Moon for 24 years, as I said. His pursuit of professional development, as well as his years of service, earned him an ICMA's designation as a credentialed manager. He was awarded Manager of the Year by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, an association of about 2,500 townships in Pennsylvania. He served as a president of APMM, and during his final year of service, he tried to resolve several ethical concerns, and his staff worked with him on those issues. There were some questionable decisions being made by the new majority of his Board of Supervisors, and he was troubled by that. And I'm going to tell a little story, briefly, of how he addressed that for about a year, and then he chose to resign. So there were three kind of issues that were really driving the problems, but it was broader than that. It wasn't just these three things. There were many little things that happened throughout the year, but I'm just picking three of the big ones. One is this, the way the new majority, 3 of the 5 board members, 2 of whom were elected in the November election, right? So that forms the new majority. And there seemed to be what Greg Smith suspected, a pay-to-play approach to municipal contracting. He could see the pattern of contributions in the campaigns, and then he saw the appointment of a solicitor and appointment of a new engineering firm done in a way that hadn't been done in Moon in 23 previous years. In Moon, what normally would have happened is there'd be a discussion with the management, with Greg Smith and his team, about who should the solicitor and the engineering firm especially. All 5 board members would talk about it, think about people they might want to send an RFP to. They would do a bidding process to see who would be their solicitor, to see who would be their engineering firm. None of that happened. The new majority came in, never told Greg Smith anything, never told the other 2 minority members of the board anything, simply announced, here's our solicitor and here's our engineering firm. That was worrisome to Greg. But you know what? He's a professional. So this is only in the first month or 2 of his job with the new board. So now he's going to work with them and try to make them better. Then a conflict of interest starts to emerge, and it troubles him greatly. Turns out the solicitor is a defense attorney. That's fine. We need defense attorneys. The trouble is that he's a solicitor and a defense attorney, and he's defending as many as 5 citizens accused by the Moon Township Police Department of violating laws. And he would appear in the new media, and he would appear in the community saying how bad and unjust the police department of Moon is, but he's also supposed to be sitting as a solicitor advising the board on municipal policy and liability issues and so on. So that was a conflict of interest as clear as day to Greg Smith, but not to the new majority, and they did nothing about it. Again, he was very troubled about that. Finally, questionable billing by the engineering firm. The engineering firm was being compensated, and even though Greg Smith and his management team objected to certain billing, they didn't want to pay it, the new majority insisted that they pay the firm. And their concerns were that work was being done by the engineering firm not authorized to be done. So it was done, and then bills are submitted, and it turns out one of the new majority members had told them to do that work, but that's not the way it's authorized, so that it's it was not appropriately channeled. The work that when the bids were submitted to be paid, the bills, to be paid, they weren't documented clearly. So it was very hard to see what work was actually done for those billable hours. And Greg Smith, having 23 years of experience working with engineering firms, knows, no, you got to document this clearly so we know why we're paying it, so we can review the quality of your work, which leads to the last concern, which was the quality of work was poor from their view. They said our own staff could spend, township engineer could spend a short amount of time on this compared to what we're being billed for. Now, I want to say all 3 of these things have a hint of illegality. Greg Smith isn't making saying this is all illegal. He suspects it, but it's mainly a concern about ethics. So although I'm going to read through this text here, if you bear with me, read along if you like. I just want to move through it. Although Moon's electoral context is partisan and competitive, I described that a little bit earlier. For 23 of the 24 years serving Moon, Smith reported that once the elected 5 supervisors took office, all worked in unison in a nonpartisan fashion, and it would be difficult for a spectator to know whether a supervisor was Republican or Democrat. So for those 23 years, it was okay to have vigorous partisan competition because how those people decided to work together after the election mattered a lot, and they cared about good government. But that broke down after one election in November of 2006. For Smith and the management teams, the action by the leaders of the new majority taking office, the 2007 election, broke with the tradition of nonpartisanship, respect for and collaboration with Moon's professional management team and the ethical practices long established in Moon's political culture. So Greg Smith steadfastly followed his personal integrity, the ICMA and APM's code of ethics. Throughout the year, he reflected on his, these issues. The impact on his personal integrity bothered him a lot. He consulted with other professional managers in the region that he knows well, around Pittsburgh area and all across Pennsylvania. I talked to him myself. He talked to the ICMA ethics advisor, Martha Parego. She's still there, and she helps give advice to professional managers when they have challenges. And he followed to the letter all the advice people gave him. He spent a year trying to persuade that new majority to change their ways. and it wasn't working. So what a professional manager can contribute, first, to a good government effort is that diligent effort for a year to try to correct the problems, even though we don't know if it's illegal, if it's just unethical. He's still trying to correct those problems. And then he can send a signal to the community. I'm resigning. That's how important this is, right? So he chose to resign, but so did his two assistants, his assistant managers on the same night. So Smith's performance illuminates the difficulty in deciding a course of action when the bright light of illegality is lacking, although suspected. I love that. Some of my best writing. Indeed, the profile features how a professional administrator and his staff found their way through the fog surrounding a series of ethical dilemmas in order to answer the basic questions, should I resign? After nearly a year of pursuing different ways to help the elected officials understand the problems he and his staff identified, and failing to persuade the majority of the board to adopt corrective courses of action, not only did Smith choose to resign after 2 decades of service, but so did both of his assistant managers. So in conclusion, highlight a few things here. First, the establishment of the Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service continues a long legacy established more than a century ago of reform in local government. The center can be like all those good government organizations of the past that promotes good government in the Scranton area and all of northeastern PA, working with many partners in the community, from the League of Women Voters, the PPL, and many, many other organizations. The adoption of a code of ethics defines the meaning of good government for the community. It inspires citizens to public service and empowers citizens to hold officials accountable to the promise of American life. Even if there's not a single case that gets processed through a board of ethics, if it's constantly part of the discussion when you run for office, and if the media brings it up, and if the center brings it up, and there's questions asked of candidates about it, it helps create some accountability that way. It's important. And finally, a great partner in any effort to have good government is to have professional management. It doesn't have to be the council manager form, doesn't have to be, it could be the mayor council form, but you've got to have professionals involved who say, I'm going to fulfill my profession's commitment to good government and ethical government. And if you have that, you have an ally within the government trying to do the right thing all the time. They are partners with elected officials to achieve the common good for their communities, and they offer a full-time commitment to ethical, efficient, effective, equitable, and responsive government. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found my talk a bit interesting and helping frame some of the legacy that we're seeing continued here. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And we do have some time for your question and answers, so if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, please stand up so everybody can hear in the room. If you don't mind.
Hi.
Thank you, Craig, for your talk.
Thank you.
This is some new information for me, and my question about professional local government managers is, and it's abstract, is there a requirement, sometimes, all the time, never, for them to have residency? So when I think of one of the sort of fundamental differences between an elected leader, government leader, versus what sounds like more of a hired, appointed, professional, merit-based hire, would be that one would say the elected official is representative of that community. So in other words, in theory, those interests play a role in the decisions made. Do councils ever require residency or some sort of like structural commitment to the local issues when they make those hires or appointments?
Thank you for your question. Yes, there's not a professional standard whether you should live in the community that you also work in or not. That's not a professional requirement. Some communities would prefer you not to live in the community because they don't want you to establish a lot of personal connections. I would say the majority would rather have you live in the community because professional managers, especially since I'd say the 1950s and 60s, they become community leaders. And the more integrated they are in the life of the community, they know people, they know organizations, they can be very supportive of different agenda items, right, that come before the council. So they're most effective when they are part of the community that way. I will say, though, that there's always a risk that they could become drawn into a faction and could, there are examples of managers who were corrupt. There's a manager out in California that stole millions of dollars, right? Every profession has its bad apples. So there's no guarantee that you'll have an ethical person. But the chances are if you hire a professional with an ICMA and APMM affiliation, that's a pretty good seal of approval. And I would say that and my advice to you would be, if you're thinking about it, is I would have them live in your community. I wouldn't require it, but you might want to ask them, if you're going to ask them to move, then they're going to ask you, can you help me with my moving expenses? It gets down to that nitty gritty, right? But that's okay. If you think it's so important, you should make that part of your plan.
I'm going to date myself now. We had a Home Rule Charter Study Commission in Scranton way back in the early 2000s. And we actually proposed a council manager form of government. Our mistake was getting that on the ballot at the same time that someone who wanted to be a strong mayor was running for mayor. And our Home Rule Charter was defeated. A lot of the questions that we heard, or a lot that were brought up, one of the issues is dealing with pay. And when you're talking about what the average pay for someone is, and we run up against this all the time in municipal positions. What does, Joe on the street earn versus now you want to pay this professional manager? In our vision, it was that the city of Scranton is a major corporation with millions of dollars in budget, a lot of responsibility, and therefore you need that professional perspective that you don't get from someone who is simply elected. How do you deal with that public perception of, well, I don't earn that much, so why should I pay a professional manager to do that? Because I think it's a real problem for us.
So the smaller communities of Pennsylvania encounter that too, not just a larger city like Scranton. For them, 60,000 might sound like a lot to them. A borough of 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people, or township, small townships, paying somebody 60 or 65,000 might seem like a lot. So they're stuck at trying to hire somebody kind of out of grad school. They've had a municipal management internship. They may have served as an assistant for 2 or 3 years. Then they're going to hire them in their first management job. They get them, they're paying them 65, and then the person leaves in 3 years for a better job in a bigger community with more money. And that's how it works. If you want to, as a municipal manager, often you move to several different size communities before you're earning an income you think is a good fit. For a larger community like Scranton, you're going to pay over $100,000, probably closer to $150,000 to $200,000 in today's dollars. It's a lot of money. But that's if you want to hire somebody with experience. They got 20 years experience, they've managed other complex communities like Scranton, and they're bringing all that wealth of knowledge and talent. It's a talent competition, and you're hiring them away from some other community. So you're going to pay a top dollar for that. But you don't have to. You can go for that middle range career person, or even someone relatively new, say within 10 years. And they won't come in for as much. You might get them for 20 or 30,000 less. So you can try to manage that challenge that way. I would, in terms of persuading people that it's worth it, the evidence is overwhelming it's worth it. You could point to many well-governed cities: Charlotte, North Carolina; San Antonio, Texas; Cincinnati, Ohio. Those are big cities that are well-governed by managers. State College has a manager, borough manager. And there's just examples in Pennsylvania that show how effective and helpful they can be to good government. Sure.
I'm kind of going to piggyback off of Andrea. First of all, I want to tell you that I loved the whole progressive thing, and as an employee of the Pennsylvania Economy League, I now know that we are from the progressive era, and
there you go.
The line you had about economy is actually in our mission statement, so that was, I found that very interesting. In Pennsylvania, we have 2,500 plus municipalities. Most of them, as you know, are very small. They don't have a lot of money. I agree with you that a professional manager is a really wonderful thing to have. Your examples were of all of townships, which generally have more money in general anyway, and also had much larger populations than a lot of these towns. We know that governance is a very big problem in Pennsylvania. How then, with this many municipalities, they can't afford, I mean, I know you're saying, yeah, it's just out of school. They really can't afford these municipal managers. I'm sorry. What, do you have any sense of, in terms of these many municipalities getting professional management in, should we be looking more at consolidating? Should we be looking at other ways to get more of that professional management, which is sorely needed, into our communities that can't afford it?
So certainly you can always try to have consolidations, but that's a long road to go down sometimes. And people love the identity they have with their small community, so they may resist it simply because of identity issues. This is my little town, I love my little town, I don't want to be merged with the larger neighbor, that kind of thing. There are programs called range rider programs where if your organization worked with APMM, for example, you could probably figure out a way to have managers, especially retired managers, might agree to participate in a range rider. So one manager might serve 3 municipalities and spend time in each municipality periodically. And the basics, they would just do the basics, make sure the budget's in great shape, that the staff is, if they have to negotiate a contract with the police union, they'll do that. There's some basic services like that that a range rider manager would do. They're not that common. Many municipalities don't want to share that, but it is possible if you had 2 or 3 relatively closely neighboring small communities, you might be able to hire a manager to serve all 2 of them or 3 of them in a range rider way. That would be my suggestion. It is hard, because small communities, you're right, they can't afford to hire an experienced manager. They have to hire the 24-year-old, 25-year-old manager. And by the way, a lot of ours 24 and 25-year-old graduates of our MPA program, and they spend a year or 2 as an assistant, they are fine managers, I assure you. They're well worth the money. But I understand why some communities find it problematic.
Right. The problem is they're not, that's not necessarily what you're seeing in the communities.
That's right.
You're seeing maybe someone come in as a secretary and they're making $30,000,
right.
But they're not in that professional organization. They don't have the degree.
No. Yeah, there's a lot of those positions, although some municipal secretaries have joined APMM and go to the conferences for the training. And that's another thing you could do. You could just encourage the municipal secretary to travel to an APMM meeting or join it, or maybe the Township Supervisors Association runs workshops for people to train them better in some basic management practices, which will help the smaller townships and boroughs.
And the Center for Ethics and Excellence
yes.
in Public Service
Yeah.
will help. One of the things we want to do is be a clearinghouse for this kind of information, so folks will know where they can get this kind of training and who's doing it, and if indeed itinerant managers who will do work in a couple of communities. So this is certainly something that the center can begin to think through. Right, Joanne? Other questions, comments?
I love this table. A lot of great questions.
I actually have
Dr. Hoffman,
for my list, I'll choose. So I actually was really compelled by the last piece that you talked about, where the individual ended up resigning as sort of a show of, this is an unethical situation and I want people to take it seriously. I guess I want to hear a little bit more about what the pros and cons of resigning in that way might be, because some individuals might think I need to stay in order to try and fix some of this. And I'm even thinking of elected officials potentially who have done this, where they resign saying, I can't function within this because it's unethical. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to some of the pros and cons of that decision to resign as a statement of ethics.
So there are personal reasons why people resign, like Greg did. His personal health situation, the stress of it all was wearing on him. So that's part of why he resigned. Not the only reason, part of it. He did stay a year, and he tried to make a difference. So I would say that a resignation shouldn't happen, right, like if he'd have resigned in January because of the appointment of a solicitor and engineering firm, I don't know. That's not really being helpful to the community. But persisting and trying to show the board, by the way, he didn't say this in the newspapers for a year. He's trying to tell the board, giving them information constantly about the questionable billing, the conflict of interest. He wasn't out there campaigning in the media to do that. He was talking to his board. And that was the strategy he used. He thought he could make a difference. And in the long run, Moon's fine. Moon's governed well now again. It wasn't a long-term problem. But I understand your point about, are you walking away from something you could help make better? And he reached the conclusion that he was no longer effective, right? After a year of effort and being ignored, he thought, I'm no longer effective. Maybe somebody different coming in new, maybe my leaving, and he had no idea his two assistants were going to resign either. He didn't know that was going to happen, but they did. One of them served for a few weeks as a transition to help, for the time period of where they could get some new people in. So I think it's always a very personal decision when you resign, and you should do it at the time that you think both takes care of yourself personally, but also has the right kind of impact. And Greg, in his case, was very concerned about not showing up or embarrassing or being accused of that, embarrassing elected officials. So he did it in a very professional way. He read a statement at the board meeting and announced his resignation. And he told him at the executive council he was going to do that right before the board meeting. As it turns out, there were 20 municipal managers in the room because they had heard he was going to resign, and they gave him a standing ovation. So his peers stuck up for him too, because they understood what he was going through. So, thank you for your question. Yeah.
I think we will close with that.
That's
Thank
fine.
you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
And I know I learned a lot of stuff, and students in my state and local class now have some stuff for the test on Wednesday. So this is
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that
so
happened to you.
thank you so much. Enjoy
Thank you, doctors. Appreciate it.
Close this out.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Wheeland. It has been our pleasure to have you, to host you, and to learn from you this weekend. Again, thank you for everyone who has worked to make this day possible. In closing, I would like to thank all of you who have attended these panels today and this keynote this afternoon for your support of the center's mission, a mission to improve government for all in northeastern Pennsylvania. The center hopes to offer resources, programming, training, but not just things that we come up with on our own, things that actually meet the needs of communities in this area. So in addition to the assessment surveys that we asked you to complete, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly, to give us feedback. Let us know the kinds of things that the center could offer to help you as public leaders, and also as students and faculty, of course, as well. So again, we look forward to growing and nurturing this community that we formed today, and broader communities that are dedicated to our state and local democracies. In the future, I hope that you will join us for other programs. And as I think I've said upon leaving every room throughout this conference, please do vote in your state and local elections and pay attention to your state and local politics. Your communities need you. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.